We'll get started. Welcome, everyone. A quick note that we are recording and that the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular to the Pamalong clan of the Awabakal people of the land in which the Callaghan campus resides, which is where we in the room are located today. Our speaker today, Lyndall Ryan, is Emeritus Professor at the University of Newcastle and the leader of the team behind the Colonial Frontier Massacres Map. She has been honoured for her contributions to women's and indigenous peoples' history by the History Council of New South Wales. She was named a member of the Order of Australia in 2019 for her scholarship and research efforts. She is leader of the digital map project Frontier Massacres Across Australia, 1788 to 1930, which after 8 years is drawing to a close. Her paper today reflects on this project and is titled Frontier Massacres Across Australia, 1794 to 1928, Approaches to the Study of Australian History. Over to you, Lyndall.
Thank you very much. And I also would like to pay my respects to the Awabakal people on whose lands we are this morning. Today, I'd like to draw attention to some aspects of the map that have begun to emerge after 8 years of working on the project. And to date, we have more than 400 sites of massacre of Aboriginal people. We've also got some sites of where white people have been massacred by Aboriginal people. We've also got a few sites where Aboriginal people have massacred other Aboriginal people, and a couple of sites where Aboriginal people have massacred both non-Aboriginal people and non-white people, that is Macassan. So those little purple dots at the top of Australia are people from the Macassan area, largely Malay fishermen. What I'd like to do with the project today is just draw on some aspects about looking at the massacres as a whole, as part of a national project. Most researchers about massacre are usually historians who are interested in a particular area. Might be a part of Tasmania or Victoria, or it might be an aspect of New South Wales or Queensland. And I have a colleague, for example, who's working on a book on the massacres that happened in the Northern Territory. But this is a national project, so I'd like to sort of draw out some aspects that we've found by looking at the massacres as a whole, as a historian. Political scientists have drawn out some other aspects. Geographers have looked very carefully at how many of the massacres seem to occur during the time of drought and so on. But I'm looking at the people who were involved on both sides. One of the first things we discovered was that the massacres seem to happen in two historical periods. The first up to 1860, which were largely in southern Australia. And I'm going to use this fine line across the bottom to show what I mean by the case. So if we go back to 1860, we see that apart from one in the Northern Territory and one on the top of Cape York, most of the others happen in what we call the southeastern, southwestern swing across Australia. That is until the period before self-government in the Australian colonies, and it gives us a good idea of that swing of pastoral settlement and also agricultural settlement. And it indicates that you can see by the squares, which are massacres by Aboriginal people of colonists, is that in fact these are, this is quite a violent period. And that so on the one hand, I'd like to ask, well, who were the perpetrators of most of the yellow dots? and who were the perpetrators of most of the blue squares. And we hadn't been taking a great deal of notice of the perpetrators in this era up to 1860. But when we pushed further back to some of the first massacres which happened, the first one is in 1794, and although it looks very close to Sydney, it's actually at the Hawkesbury, what we call Australia's first frontier. And it's interesting that we don't have any massacres around the early settlement of Sydney itself, although there are a few cases of where 5 Aboriginal people were killed rather than 6. If you read the introduction very closely, you'll see that there's a definition of massacre and the methodology that we've used. We don't have any cases of where what would constitute a massacre happening in the Sydney region. It's not until they move out to the Hawkesbury River at the base of the Blue Mountains that we begin to get what we call the massacre period starting. And if I move a bit further on, you'll see that they gradually change. So we've got a cluster of massacres along the Hawkesbury that happened between 1794 and 1810, and then gradually moving up to 1820. What is interesting about these is that in every case except one, the massacres are carried out by British soldiers and largely they're carried out by soldiers from British regiments which are stationed in Australia. And some of these soldiers choose, when the regiment is recalled, stay in Australia and take up land and make a life for themselves. And so we know some of these massacres quite well because they're either reported in the local press or they're reported in government dispatches and so on. They're quite open about it. These soldiers saw themselves as defending the frontier, the earlier frontier. And perhaps the most famous one from this period is the massacre at Hobart in Risdon Cove, which is the most highly contested massacre in Australia even today, which is interesting. It was carried out in May 1804, and it was widely reported. But in 1830, a witness to that particular massacre gave his account to a government inquiry being held in Hobart. And that witness has been subjected to the most incredible scrutiny, particularly over the last 20 years. They say that he was a convict and therefore he was probably lying, or a former convict and probably lying. There was no record of the convict actually arriving in Hobart in the months leading up to the massacre. There's no evidence of certain other aspects of his life. And so there have been about 5 books published about the Risdon Cove massacre, all trying to prove that it didn't happen, that it was an invention at the time. However, the most recent account, which is in a journal article in a Tasmanian historical journal, is indicating that it's more likely to have been there than not, and it was unlikely that it would have made it up. But you can see how highly contested some massacres are. So we're looking up to 1820. There's not a lot, but they are largely, except in one case, carried out by soldiers. In the first case from the New South Wales Regiment, which was established to defend the colony, which at that stage also included Tasmania. And so the military records are not telling us a great deal, but when it's reported to the governor or something like that, then we do get more information. And as we move on, I'll go back, we found that all the first massacres in earlier settlements, we'll have to go to Brisbane, up here, and in Perth, were all carried out by British soldiers. And in 1834, the Governor of Western Australia led a massacre at Pinjarra. So the massacres are very much the responsibility of the soldiers who are sent out not only to guard the convicts, but really to ensure that settlement can take place. I was very interested to find this, so I went off searching for histories of the New South Wales Corps. We still await a history of the first regiment that served in Australia and was here for 20 years. We have no histories of any of the other regiments which served in the colonies up until at least the gold rushes and a bit beyond. And I think it's interesting that there's a goldmine of information we are still awaiting to find. And I think that's very interesting. And it's not until really we get to 1840 that we get this, a really dramatic increase in the territory the frontiers being pushed back. The population is dramatically increasing. We still have convict transportation in this part, on the eastern part of Australia, at least in New South Wales up to 1840 and Tasmania up to 1852. However, by 1830, the Black War is largely over in Tasmania, and so the frontiers are moving. We have a lot of people, settlers, former soldiers, convicts who served in Tasmania, rushing across Bass Strait and into what is the present-day Victoria. Those people knew how to carry out massacres, and so we have a trained workforce really that can conduct massacre, which continues up to the discovery of gold in 1851, and the story of Victoria changes dramatically. We get very few massacres in Victoria after 1850. There might be one or two in the far reaches. So by the time we reach 1850, we have a sense of exactly where the frontiers of colonial settlement are. And the project that the massacre map is now folded into in Victoria at the University of Melbourne, is really looking at the groups that are doing that. But it's interesting, right up until the late 1840s, most of the massacres are carried out either by serving British soldiers or soldiers who chose to stay in the Australian colonies when the regiment was recalled. Usually the regiments did a tour of duty in the Australian colonies of about 6 years, then they would move on to India, perhaps the West Indies, perhaps the Cape Colony. So these soldiers were part of the front line of the British Empire. And it's interesting how many of them chose to stay. Australia was very healthy. India was incredibly unhealthy. We have a regiment which served in Tasmania throughout the Black War up to 1830 and was then redeployed to India. And within the first 6 months, nearly half the officers had died from disease. The West Indies was similarly a very unhealthy place to serve. So Australia looked like a good long-term opportunity. And they certainly were prepared to take up land leases on the frontier. So what I'm trying to say here is that the men on the frontier were usually quite skilled. They knew how to handle a musket. They knew how to plan a massacre, and they knew how to carry it out. Perhaps another important aspect of this, looking at this early frontier up to 1860, is that until the mid-1820s, all of these massacres are being carried out on foot at night. It's the regiments were infantry regiments. It was very expensive to have cavalry, and as time went on, the local colonial governments are expected to pay for any extras for the soldiers. That is, if they wanted the soldiers to be mounted, then the colonies had to pay for it. But what we do find by the mid-1820s is that as the frontier is expanding, horses are essential to do that. And so individual soldiers from the regiments are being deployed by the colonial governments on horses. So in the mid-1820s, we get the first mounted, what we call the first mounted police. We don't get any mounted police in Tasmania. The whole of the Black War is carried out on foot, and most of the massacres are attacks on Aboriginal camps at night. But once horses enter the story, and particularly around Newcastle and along the Hunter and up over the Liverpool Range, this is carried out on horseback. And so horses make a dramatic change. But it is interesting that the first horses that are used are mounted police. They're soldiers who train the stockman, and stockman is a mounted stock keeper, how to conduct a massacre, how to plan and carry them out. So the importance of the military cannot be underestimated, at least right up until the mid-1840s. In the 1840s, we have the 99th Regiment, which is the last of the regiments to serve on the frontier, carrying out massacres on the Darling Downs in west of Brisbane and around here, and they're carrying around here, and of course they're carrying out on the southwest in Perth. As I said, so this first part of the massacre story really is very much to do with the availability of both infantry soldiers and the availability of horses as a backup. And by the 1860s, really, you can't really do a massacre without horses. So these two aspects are very important. The research team has been doing some comparative research with South Africa, the Cape Colony, where there's possible similar kinds of carrying out of massacre and the spread of British settlement. We've also been looking at New Zealand with the New Zealand Wars, both of the 1840s and the 1860s. And we find that in relation to the wars of the 1840s, the British regiments which are stationed in Sydney are sent across to New Zealand. And when they come back, they're also carrying out massacres. So they're all connected, I guess. This is not something that is peculiar to Australia. It is part of the settler colonies of the British Empire. And I think that's important. I've found settlers who started their career in a British regiment in the Cape Colony, present-day South Africa, who's then come across to Australia and tried to make a go of it out on the frontier. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. They'll go then to New Zealand, try their luck, and then come back to Australia. And I thought this was a select few of settlers, but we find that it was quite common. But most of them had started their career in a regiment in the British Army. So the British Army, of course, we would expect it when you've got to run an empire, it's usually run by the British Army and the British Navy. And when we're looking at Australian history, we tend to forget the significance of both the Army and the Navy, in providing settlers. We know about settler soldiers in the 20th century, but we've also got settler soldiers in the 19th century, and they are prepared to take risks. Let's go back to these first massacres along the Hawkes River. The first massacre is actually carried out by settlers. And the governor in Sydney is very shocked. We can't have settlers defending the frontier. We have to have soldiers. So several detachments of the New South Wales Corps are deployed to the current present-day town of Windsor. And I think there's nearly 100 overall sent out. But the settlers, those first settlers who carried out the first massacres, were former soldiers from the New South Wales Corps. So I think that's very important. These people are not innocents abroad. Some of the convicts, of course, are also former soldiers, and they are encouraged to go and take up land on the frontier because the governor knows that they've got the skills to defend the frontier. So I think that's an important aspect of understanding what that is about. So let's move, and I think that's an important aspect of doing this. So let's move on to the second part, post-1860 up to 1830. By 1860, most of all the colonies, except Western Australia, have self-government. And the colony of Queensland, which is established in 1859, has self-government from the outset. It doesn't have a period where the British government is determining what's going on. So if we move from 1860, say, to 1880, we see again the gradual spread, and this is moving from sheep and cattle to more exclusively cattle. This is cattle country across here, and getting into cattle, you need much more land. Instead of having 20,000 acres, as you might have if you were a successful sheep farmer in New South Wales and Victoria, you've now got 200,000 acres. So it's really big. There's this smaller British population, colonial population. It's more mobile. They'll take up a lease, a cattle lease, overstock. A couple of massacres take place, and then there's a drought. So the settlers will move on and take up another cattle lease. And what we've found in the post-1860 period is the same people might be carrying out massacres here in the 1860s, but by the 1880s, it's the same people over here. Now, the owners of these leases are very rarely there. They're usually in Brisbane or Sydney and most likely Melbourne. Melbourne is the finance capital of Australia. It has succeeded from the gold rushes, and it's attracting a lot of overseas capital, and it knows how to use that capital to fund these very large grazing leases in Queensland and then the Northern Territory, which at this stage, of course, is owned by South Australia, because the grazing land in South Australia is being used up by 1860, and so they encourage encourage the British government to give them the Northern Territory and to be responsible for it. We do get South Australian graziers coming up, and they do some pretty terrible things, but it's more from here, from New South Wales to Queensland and across this track, across the Gulf country into the north. Always hoping for better land, and of course the further north you move, the more tropical the land becomes, more difficult, very fast flowing rivers, and so on. But droughts come, and really the north is really about the relationship between drought and flood, which I think still happens, of course, but it really is very important. And there's always the belief that the town of Palmerston, which is now Darwin, which does have a port, at some point they have a large abattoir established, so cattle can be taken there for slaughter, and then with the invention of refrigeration, ships can call in and get the carcasses and take them to Europe. So these massacres are concerned with the technological development of Australia. There are two major technologies. One is the overland telegraph in the 1870s, and in Queensland right up to Cape York in the 1890s. We also get the development of the Kimberley, which has, again, ports which can, I'll get that up to 1900, which can get, again, take cattle to ports for export. So without the invention of the telegraph and without the invention of refrigeration, the North probably would not have been turned into cattle stations at that time. There has to be an economic reason to do it. It's a slightly different, although there's always an economic undercut for settlement, it's large scale. It's a large-scale settlement. Many of these cattle stations in the north are not only bankrolled by Melbourne financiers, but also British companies. There's about half a dozen British companies which really bankroll all of these major pastoral stations in the north. They will bring in a manager, and the manager will be an experienced stockman who knows what to do. The book We of the Never Never, which is set in the Roper River area in the Northern Territory, and which does talk about a massacre in the book, is owned by an overseas by a British company, and the people working on that particular cattle lease at Roper River are all very experienced stockmen, and they know how to defend it. So this is a story we're just beginning to unpick now. We've got some families which we can trace. There's one family I've been able to trace from Tasmania to the Western District of Victoria, up to the Darling Downs, up to the back of Rockhampton, and over here, over 4 generations. There's probably a couple more. So we're getting professionals. These are not people who are sort of coming across this need to kill. These are people who are professional. And I think we're beginning to learn a lot more about these people and what they are doing. A little word about, and we can see that the overland telegraph is an area where it runs up from Adelaide across and up to present-day Darwin. Is a very important site. And thank goodness the people who worked on the overland telegraph and maintained it had to write reports. So we do have a lot of evidence about massacres that happen along the telegraph line. The telegraph line that goes from about here right up to Cape York, which is established in the 1890s, is also an important site. In other words, it's an important technological boundary that has to be protected so that the rest of Australia can get news. And for people up north, the rest of Australia was Melbourne. Melbourne was the finance capital. Sydney doesn't get much of a story at all. I was shocked by that as a Sydney person. But Melbourne is really the finance capital. And it's the names of McElwraith and McKeown, these big pastoral companies are all based in Melbourne. even though the Bank of New South Wales, which is another big bankroller, is based in Sydney, but it's the Melbourne financiers that really bankroll the development of the north. And I find that quite interesting. And we've also been very fortunate in finding somebody gave us the copy of a letter of one of the bigger Melbourne families who served up in the Gulf country on a property up there, and how they had to prepare for a massacre. And that, of course, was like finding gold. Writing a letter, the young guy who's about 19 writing a letter to his 16-year-old sister about what it's like working up there. So we find that massacre is very much part of the colonisation of Australia in different ways. But what we've found, particularly in the north, is you need capital to do it. You need the most up-to-date weapons that you can fire from horses. And the most up-to-date weapons are the results of both the Crimean War and the American Civil War. These are expensive equipment, and they're needed. So you can't be running properties on virtually no money. Even after World War I, when there's some few soldier settlements, settlers' properties established in the Kimberley on very poor land, they are returned soldiers. Most of them don't have families. They seem to be very, very dispossessed people in their own way, but they're very good at carrying out massacre. And some of the better known ones, like Forest River in 1926, is largely carried out by a cluster of returned servicemen who served in the Middle East and kept together afterwards, taken up some not very good pastoral land, and really they found that killing Aborigines was sort of the one thing they could do very well. We need to explore a lot of that. And let's turn to Queensland, because we've got an expert here in the room on my right who's written a fantastic doctorate on kidnapping of Aboriginal people in Queensland. And he has found that kidnapping was not only rife and widespread, but many of the kidnappings of children and women happened in the aftermath of massacre. Queensland is a little different because it had a native police force. And the native police were in operation from the late 1840s up to 1905. So the major period of pastoral expansion in Queensland. The native police we have very few reports of their activities. They all had every detachment had a white officer, and some of these officers might have come from well-known families from other parts of Australia, but they were often the son who just couldn't make a living, used the family name to get appointed, had a bit of army experience, and had no difficulty in shooting Aboriginal people. Slightly different ways from these ones in the Northern Territory and the Kimberley, and a big story, which is why we have so many massacres in Queensland. And we also have quite a few massacres by Aboriginal people of colonial people. The ones up in the north of Cape York were the result of shipwrecks, where the ship was wrecked and Aboriginal people would slaughter the survivors. You see a number coming down the coast. These, however, are massacres on colonial properties and led to the most enormous retribution of other massacres. I'd like to talk about this massacre here, which is, I'll just expand the map, because we have to discuss the question of war. This massacre here is a massacre by the Wiradjuri people of 7 stockmen over a 24-hour period in Bathurst that took place in May 1824. These stockmen were right on the boundary of settlement, right on the frontier. So this massacre of 7 stockmen, or stockkeepers, they were stockmen, they had been on horseback, but they were not when they were killed. And it led to what we call the Bathurst Wars, where several detachments of one of the British regiments were sent out to Bathurst and divided into 3. It's been well reported, we know a lot about it. But it was this particular massacre by the Wiradjuri people that led to the Bathurst War of 1824, where martial law was declared in August for a spring offensive against the Wiradjuri. And the massacres, these 3 massacres here, are the result of that. So this is a clear case where Aboriginal people were trying to prevent the frontier from moving forward. And I think that's an excellent example. We also think that these stockmen had been taking Aboriginal women for sex, and but we're not absolutely certain, but it appears to be the case. We're beginning to learn a lot more about the Bathurst Wars, and next year, 2024, will be the bicentenary of the Bathurst Wars, and a major acknowledgement of the wars is going to take place in Bathurst. So I think that's really important and very interesting. Perhaps just to conclude, because I think people will have questions. Just a word about Tasmania. Tasmania is, while it's first settled in 1803, 1804, the real expansion of colonial settlement starts in the 1820s. Most of the settlers who came were former defence officers from the Napoleonic Wars, who've been promised in the post-war period that they can have land, that they can, become the gentry, and they'll have convict servants to work for them. In the 1820s, wool is king. In the early 1820s, the tariff on wool coming into Britain is scrapped. So wool can be exported, and of course it doesn't have to be frozen. It doesn't need refrigeration. So wool is a very handy export to grow the Australian colonies in the 1820s and the 1830s. Note that most of the massacres take place in this really on the Midland Plain between Hobart in the south and Launceston in the north. It's not a very big area. It's about 80 kilometres wide, and it's about just over 180 kilometres long. So it's as someone pointed out to me, not a very large battlefield. And there's no doubt that British soldiers were posted at points along the entire area. It's a flat plain, and it's in that area that most of the massacres take place. People are re-looking at the Black War in Tasmania in terms of the military tactics that are used and the number of former military settlers who are there and who are very eager correspondents to the governor. They're very keen to tell him what's going on. They're very keen to tell him where soldiers should be deployed to kill the Aboriginal people. And because it's such an important case study, we're getting a new study that's been carried out again. The other area that is undergoing a lot of new research is the Western District of Victoria, which is an absolute killing field over a short period of time. That's the other point we find about the southern Australia, is that the period of intense military conflict is over a very limited period of time. In Tasmania, it's a period of about 6 or 7 years. In Victoria, in the Western District, it's between about 1838 and 1850, so that's 12 years. The Darling Downs is a period again around here in the 1840s. So we can see that in a way the frontier is held back until there's either more people or more technology to move it. Let me just... So this area in Australia is really very important for understanding how it all works. It's a very concentrated area over a period of time that goes from about the 1840s to the 1870s. So it's a very intense period. And while British soldiers are pulled from the frontier by 1850, they're replaced by mounted police, and they're replaced in Queensland by the native police. So there's always military. Most of the massacres are carried out in a military context. I think that's important to know. I've talked for probably long enough. I'm sure people have questions. I'll be very pleased to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lyndall. That was absolutely fascinating. Can I open the floor to questions? And I might use my prerogative as chair to leap in there. So you've spoken through the sort of technological change that have been driving things, and that's been absolutely fascinating. Is it possible to identify a change in the responses that Indigenous people are trying to deploy? Is there, I mean, in response to the frequency of massacres, or?
That's a good question. I haven't really found it because it's always the next group of Aboriginal people. It's not the same people being attacked all the time. I think the real changes come from the way the massacres are carried out because of the changes in technology, particularly in gun technology. I mean, the early massacres are carried out with brown bess muskets, which have to be, reprimed and, and you have to fire from a standing position. Once the horse arrives, they start using carbines. You can fire from the horse. And by the time you get to the Northern Territory and North Queensland, you can stand nearly a mile away and shoot. The 19th century changes in weapons technology is extraordinary. And it's interesting because in the 18th century, there isn't much of a change. But it seems like the Crimean War in the mid-1850s is the first real change to modern army weapons. And then a decade later, with the American Civil War, you get the Winchester rifle, and you get in European wars the Martini Henry. They're just more powerful, and the cartridges are bigger. They can blow a person to bits from quite a distance. So I guess the perpetrators are becoming more bold.
Right, okay.
They can do it in the daylight, but still the most favoured time to have a massacre is at dawn, a campsite, because the people are asleep. They don't have the weapons, ready. They've got to get up and either run off. And over time, with more horses, Aboriginal people are driven over long distances and shot. And the last major massacre that we know in 1928 at Coniston, it takes place over 6 weeks.
Okay.
And so people can go and up one creek bed and chase them on horseback and kill them, go back to the homestead, refuel, get new weapons, replace or new lots of cartridges and so on, and go off in another direction. So they're really literally killing whole groups of people.
Right, yes.
So it's that's what we see the changes. We do see a few cases of sort of resistance. We get the one in the in 1843, where Aboriginal people are standing on a cliff face and they're throwing rocks at the big rocks at people, and that throws the settlers back, and so they have to get a detachment of soldiers in to help them do that. So it's really, and there's no doubt that settlement is certainly held back. In some cases for a few years, and that might also be because of not only Aboriginal people, but also it might be in drought. And when settlement can happen, everything is overstocked.
Right.
So we've got examples in the Channel Country in southwestern Queensland, whereby Aboriginal people might be killed here, and then the settlers might overstock, and then a drought comes, and so then they just move on because the land seems to be endless. That view of Australia has endless land, and of course this is where conservationists are saying, well, the land isn't endless, but they do a lot of damage. There's no doubt about that. And certainly if you drive from Launceston to Hobart today on the Midland Highway in Tasmania, it's a blasted heath.
Mm-hmm.
And the argument is that this is overstocking of sheep.
Right. That's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
Nancy, you have a question.
Thank you, Lyndall. It's always wonderful to hear you speak about this. It's such a serious topic, and you have just such a depth and breadth of knowledge that you can sit there and talk us through it in a very matter-of-fact way for what remains just a horrifying aspect of Australian history. And I have so many questions that I'd like to bring up, but I want to start with one. I'll just ask one that is maybe a little bit provocative, and that is, given that the native police were responsible for the killing in Queensland, much of it, why are the markers there yellow and not blue?
Well, strangely enough, Nancy, most of the yellow dots are not from native police.
Okay.
The native police are not, there's a few from the native police, but they're always led by white officers, and all the orders are being given by white officers. But secondly, many of the massacres are in fact carried out by settlers themselves. And if they're having problems, they will send a message down to Brisbane, or not to Brisbane, to where there's native police barracks. And we know that a lot of native police barracks were established all over Queensland. And a stockman will write in and say, my boss has sent me down to say we need help. And so, yes, some of them are native police, but by no means all. Certainly, we do have cases where there's been a shipwreck and the people on the ship have been killed by Aboriginal people, and then boatloads a boatload will be of native police and others will be sent up from Brisbane to exact retribution. There's no doubt about that. Yeah.
All right, thank you for that. And of course, the role of the animals, the horses, the cattle, the sheep is fascinating to me, but I'll take that up with you.
Yes, that's very interesting. I think that does need to be taken up because I think what this project has revealed is whole areas that we know very little about, and we should. I think that is important. I mean, I talked at the beginning about the British regiments. There are no histories of any of those British regiments that served in Australia, including the one that was established specifically to serve in New South Wales, which served here for 20 years. I mean, you can do a lot of damage in 20 years. The last regiment that really served on the frontier, the 99th Regiment, I'm hoping that I think I found someone who will want to write a history of the regiment in Australia, of that regiment, because it served both in Sydney, in Brisbane, in Melbourne. We think it might have been serving at the Eureka Stockade. It had another detachment in Adelaide and also a big detachment in Tasmania. So these regiments really are very important to particularly the history of colonial Australia, very much so. And many of the officers left diaries and things like that. So we do need to know more.
Thank you for your
You have a question on the chat from James Garlick, who's asking, you spoke about the role of the telegraph. Is there also evidence of the spread of railways contributing to frontier violence?
Haven't come across the railways, they're much later. But the telegraph, did you come across any railways in your work?
Not so much, no.
No. The railways take a while to spread out from the major cities. It's possible in WA. No, they're not really there in the Kimberley. No, not too much later.
So they're effectively following on behind the frontier, so to speak. Interesting.
Yes, but it's a good question because, those of us who were brought up on Westerns in the movies, the railway played a huge role.
Sure, absolutely.
It's the telegraph in Australia.
Other questions?
Yep. You spoke about the pastoral industry and sheep and cattle as in being the economic driver of the frontier moving. Does the pearling and beige de mer industry sort of have a similar effect, or is that kind of peripheral to what's going on?
Well, it's certainly peripheral in the sense that the industries are in Cape York and then over in Broome. And they're certainly there, but I don't think they're particularly responsible for any massacres. I mean, we have to remember that a massacre is a minimum of 6 people. Aboriginal people have been killed all the time. I think that I would estimate that the massacres, the total of the massacres and total killed from massacres would be about a third of all Aboriginal people killed. So I think the numbers at the moment, and we have to use, we're always using the minimum numbers killed. That's what we do as an academic. If somebody said, 300 people killed here, that is so rare that you just have to say, I think that's got exaggerated over time. It might end up being 150 or 200. So you have to take that into account. Some people are very anxious to give the exact number. And I've found I've had to read a lot of military history to do this project, and how people estimate numbers killed is another interesting paper in itself. But I think that we've estimated more than 11,000 killed from these massacres. And I think the number is probably close to 20,000. But I still think that number is a third of what might have been killed overall, which gets us to 60. But in Queensland alone, it is estimated that the native police killed 60,000 Aboriginal people. So we've got to do a lot more work. a lot more work and get, we've had a big project on the native police barracks that were established in Queensland over a period of more than 40 years. And many of the barracks were in existence for more than 10 years, and they were going out on regular patrols. The native police went out on patrol, and we've got historians in Queensland who've estimated how many Aboriginal people might be killed in a typical patrol of so many weeks. So we've got a lot more work to do. We're barely scratching the surface with this project.
I've got a quick question.
Yes.
You talked about any sort of an exchange, transnational exchange of
Yes.
soldiers, Australian, New Zealand, Cape Colony. That made me wonder, is the pattern of massacre in Australia and the chronology you've set out, do you think it's a particularly Australian story? Are there parallels, say, with like North America with Cape Colony, or do you think it's a singular?
I think there's going to be certain similarities. This kind of work has not been done elsewhere, and that's our problem. We're hoping that it will encourage others from, say, the Cape Colony, from South Africa. There's been work done on particular provinces in South Africa. And of course, there are several different kinds of native peoples in South Africa. So every place has got its own differences. When I gave my first presentation on the massacre map in 2017, there were New Zealanders in the audience who said, we think similar things happened in New Zealand, but we haven't done any research. That was interesting. New Zealand was the last place where I expected to find this. We need to do more work on Western Canada, and there's been some work, and there is work now being conducted in the west of the United States. Again, in particular states of the US. Wyoming is a classic example. So I think once more work is done, we'll find both some similarities, but we'll find important differences and characteristics that will identify, for Australia, it was like this. In comparison with Western Canada, it was something else again. The work is really just starting.
There's a comment in the chat from Paul in regards to that, to say that the West Indies and slave results and British military involvement might be useful.
Oh yes, definitely. And certainly in the Kimberley, we do know that Aboriginal people were employed as labour, which was slavery.
And Jeff Keating, who was also commenting earlier about how it's great that this is happening on National Sorry Day, and it's a
Yes,
great,
it is.
and it's a great, perhaps reconciliation would be more advanced if people, were more willing to recognise what we're seeing here. Is also making the point that perhaps there's a flow over to our colonial role in Papua New Guinea that might be.
Yes, that's slightly different, but that's got to be done. Papua New Guinea after first of all, Australians didn't get to Papua New Guinea until much later, in the 1870s. And New Guinea, of course, was a League of Nations territory after World War I. That's got to be worked through. I spent some time in Papua New Guinea in the late 1960s. Had I known what I know now about Australia, I would have asked more questions. So, yes, it is very interesting.
And I'd just like to say, I think the fact that this is a unique international project speaks to the ambition and difficulty and time that has gone into this. And that's why it's not replicated elsewhere, because it's hard work, but it's important work.
Yes. And, if I was doing it again, would I do it differently? Well, of course. But you have to make all the mistakes and go down rabbit holes and all kinds of things to realise that's not the way to do it. But there's no common way to do it. You really are reliant on any kind of information you can get. In the Northern Territory, we found some important archaeological work that's been done. In others, we've been very reliant on newspapers. Up the whole of the east coast of Australia, newspapers have provided important information, and also important information from the Northern Territory, right up the north, in the Melbourne newspapers. So where you find the information, you expect perhaps that will be in the Adelaide Press. Well, some of it is, but Melbourne does seem to have tentacles. It's not only the finance capital, but it's also the place where you're most likely to find information about a massacre in the Northern Territory. So it's learning all of those tricks, and it takes time.
We're coming up towards the end of our time. I was wondering, would you be able to tell us a bit about, you've mentioned that there's a Melbourne project that will be sort of carrying on from here.
Yes.
Perhaps you could tell us something about that?
Yes, the Melbourne project is designed to, it's a very social science project. So it's looking at weather patterns across Australia when all this was happening. So we've got a couple of demographers who are trying out new techniques of estimating Aboriginal populations. We have economists who are looking at the economies of scale. I've learned a lot from them about how much it costs to run a pastoral property in Queensland in the 1880s, for example. So they're kind of providing more depth. We have a geographer who's very interested in soil. So it's kind of, they consider that they're providing more depth of all the questions that we've raised but haven't been able to answer in that way. And we've got somebody who does a lot of weather. What was the weather doing in the 1880s in Northern Australia, for example? And what was it doing in the southwest from Perth in the 1840s, in the 1850s? We know a lot of these questions in relation to Tasmania because it's small, it's an island, and people have been interested in all of these questions for a long time. So in many ways, Tasmania is a kind of base from which we jump off in relation to these kinds of questions. And what is the best kind of land do you need to graze 20,000 sheep? It's that kind of thing. What we can say is that just about everywhere that massacres happened, there was overgrazing. People had borrowed a lot of money and they wanted to, raise several models of sheep and to pay off their debts as fast as possible and make a fortune and return to England. The idea of returning home is very important, whether you're in Tasmania or whether you're in the Kimberley. Returning home was very important. How many returned home? Somebody's going to work on that. So it's all these unanswered questions that are thrown up. And there's also case studies of Aboriginal communities where we know massacres took place and what's happened, how are those communities today? And one of the communities is out at Moree in New South Wales. There's another one in the Daly River in the Northern Territory. And they're still in a pretty bad state. So it is dragging it up to the present in that way. That's all too much for me, as you can see. So you do need a fresh group of people who've got their own specialities to bring to it. And I think the project is now, it's based in Melbourne, but it's now also spreading to the University of Queensland. So there's more people there who want to be involved in it. So I think that's going to take off into another vast world.
Fascinating. And we've got a question on the chat as to where people can find out more about that project.
Yes. They do have a website. I will arranged for that website to be put on the map website. Bill Pascoe, who's done all of our mapping, is working on the Melbourne project, and I'll get Bill to give a pointer to the Melbourne site.
And perhaps we can include that information also in the in the text information on the YouTube recording of this.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great.
All right. So please join me in thanking Lyndall again for an absolutely fantastic presentation.
You know, it's so interesting to find that we're on National Reconciliation Day to be giving this. I knew that you had set that up.
So this is the final in our seminar series for semester 1, but a great lineup for semester 2 is already in the works. So please keep an eye out for the program appearing in your email box in the near future. Until then, thank you very much, everyone, and have a great break.
Thank you.